Guys, thanks. Good morning, everybody. A cryptic warning to the world from President Donald Trump during a meeting with military leaders. He's saying, quote, "This is the calm before the storm." The exact meaning, however, sparking a lot of speculation this morning, and that's where we begin on this Friday morning. Good morning. I'm Bill Hemmer, live in America's Newsroom Friday.
Good morning to you, Bill. I'm Sandra Smith. The president using the ominous phrase during a dinner last night with top Pentagon brass. And with tensions rising around the world, his comments suggesting something major could be in the works.
You guys know what this represents? Well, it's the calm before the storm.
What's the storm?
Could be the calm before the storm.
What storm is
We have the world's great military people in this room, I will tell you that. And we'll have a great evening. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
What storm, Mr. President?
You'll find out.
So with that, Kristen Fisher leads our coverage live on the North Lawn. Kristen, good morning. Any clarification from the White House about what storm he was talking about there?
Bill, no clarification from the White House, but boy, what a cliffhanger. You know, was he referring to North Korea? Remember, just a few days ago, he told his Secretary of State that he was wasting his time trying to negotiate with Pyongyang. Or maybe he was referring to ISIS fighters in Niger, where 3 U.S. Green Berets were killed just this week. Or maybe he was referring to Iran. You know, President Trump has just 9 days to decide whether or not he will decertify the Iran nuclear deal. Several of his top military advisors have advised him against it, including many of the people that were at that dinner at the White House last night. But President Trump has repeatedly said that he believes the deal is not in the nation's best interest. And when asked last night, you know, when can we expect a decision, he replied, very shortly.
We must not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons. The Iranian regime supports terrorism and exports violence, bloodshed, and chaos across the Middle East. That is why we must put an end to Iran's continued aggression and nuclear ambitions. They have not lived up to the spirit of their agreement, and we will be discussing that tonight.
Now, if President Trump does indeed decide to decertify the deal, what that would do is it would essentially just kick the can to Congress. It would give lawmakers 60 days to decide whether or not they want to impose more sanctions or new sanctions on Iran, Bill.
All right, now on Las Vegas, Congress will begin debating this issue of gun control, specifically the gun stocks. Where does the White House stand on that, Kristen?
Well, the White House says that they are welcoming this debate and that they want to be included in the conversation going forward. If you don't know what we're talking about, it's been in the news a lot, but these bump stocks are the devices that the Vegas shooter used, which allow semi-automatic rifles to behave like fully automatic weapons, like machine guns. So President Trump was asked last night, do you believe that bump stocks should be banned? Here's what he said.
We'll be looking into that over the next short period of time. We'll be looking into that over the next short period of time.
And right now, there is a bill that is making its way through Congress that would do just that. And, Bill, it has bipartisan support, so it could get support from this White House as well.
Thanks, Kristen. Kristen Fisher leading our coverage today from the White House. Sandra.
Meanwhile, Republicans opening the door to regulating bump stocks, the device used by the Las Vegas shooter to convert semi-automatic rifles into virtual machine guns. So what does the NRA have to say?
The other side, on the other hand, is been so outright trying to politicize this tragedy that we did feel the need to speak out today on this whole bump stock issue. What the NRA has said is we ought to take a look at that, see if it's in compliance with federal law, and it's worthy of additional regulation. That being said, we didn't say ban, we didn't say confiscate.
Very interesting distinction there. Needed regulation, or is it a slippery slope? That debate ahead with our panel. But first, new details on the investigation as we learn that gunman Stephen Paddock reportedly scouted out other music festivals, including Lollapalooza in Chicago. We're also getting new footage showing the aftermath of the scene. You can see overturned chairs, purses, shoes, all left behind in the chaos and confusion. We're also getting another new piece of footage, and it shows people running from the Mandalay Bay as the gunfire rings out.
Go now! Go! Go!
Moments of sheer terror now giving way to mourning. Here's what it looked like last night in Las Vegas. Thousands attending a candlelight vigil for Officer Charleston Hartfield, who was killed in the shooting. Will Carr has the latest from Las Vegas. Will, are investigators making any progress in learning the motive of this shooter?
Well, good morning, Sandra. Authorities are being fairly tight-lipped this morning. We do know that the FBI is analyzing all of the gunman's technology as they continue to try to figure out if he had any help in this attack. And it comes as they're also looking into all of the witness accounts that played out last Sunday night, including this chilling video.
Keep your head down, go! Keep your head down, go!
The man who shot that video was a city employee. He ended up racing a number of people and putting them in the back of his city work truck and driving them to safety. And when you see that video, you can understand why there are still more than 100 people in local hospitals here, including here at the University Medical Center. Sandra.
Will, how's the city continuing to respond to this horrific act of violence?
Well, they're really pulling together, and that includes people who live here and even people from out of town, including a carpenter from Chicago who drove in town yesterday, and he set up 58 wooden crosses in front of the iconic Welcome to Las Vegas sign. And that was really a stunning visual reminder of the tragic loss that we had last Sunday night, Sandra.
Well, thank you.
President Trump wrapping up a jam-packed week. Want to bring in Chris Steyerwalt, Fox News politics editor, to recap all of it. And Chris, just to recap for you, massacre early Monday morning our time, Puerto Rico on Tuesday, Las Vegas on Wednesday, and the calm before the storm last night. Take your pick.
It's been a week. It's been a week, my friend. And not just for the president, but for the whole country. He's had to explore the different roles. He has come to inhabit the presidency, obviously, in a different way than any of his predecessors have, but he also has started to see, obviously, the utility of some of the traditional roles of being presidential. That is to say, helping the nation come together in times of trouble, directing disaster response, these kinds of things. He does them in a different way, but he is learning, obviously, to do them.
If you look at the visits to the hospital, that was a high point of the week. Just relating to the wounded with the First Lady in a very human way.
I think his ability, what we have seen from both of them, is their abilities in the series of disasters, tragedies that they have faced in the period of his presidency brief so far, is that people respond really well to them. They responded well to them in Houston after the hurricanes. People respond well when they get on the ground, when they are humanized, and they're with these folks. Things seem to go really well. People seem to respond well, and that's something I think that his handlers at the White House and the team that he's got together there now understands, which is this is something good for him and probably good for the country to get him in contact with ordinary folks.
All right, go ahead and read between the lines. What's calm before the storm mean? I don't think he's talking about Nate in the Gulf of Mexico.
No, I don't think he's talking about that. Who could say? This is a reality show host. He loves a cliffhanger. I assume he looked around and saw all the brass, all the scrambled eggs on all the shoulders in that room when he had his general corps, these general officers together, and he thought, this is an awesome picture. This is going to look great. And then he's got them together, and I assume he thinks, this will scare Kim Jong-un. This will scare, this is a guy who likes military parades. He likes big shows of strength and force.
He likes generals.
He likes the military. Generals, exactly. He likes all this. He likes all that sassafras. So why not? I guess if you're him and you're thinking about writing the script of your own presidency, create a little cliffhanger here and make Iran or make North Korea think, what is he talking about?
Quickly on Iran, do you think this White House makes a move to try and push Congress to back off on these, or tighten the sanctions, I should say?
I would say they're going to probably go the other way. They're going to try to back channel the Senate, or encourage Congress not to apply the sanctions so that the president himself can publicly say, we're out of the deal, but then let the sanctions not be imposed on Iran to give them more time to operate, because they need for this not to fall apart right now. But the president also doesn't want to keep having to say every 90 days, we're certifying that Iran's good, we're certifying that Iran's good.
Much more on that coming up. Thank you, Chris. Have a great weekend. Chris Starwalt there in Washington, D.C. Quickly, just back to Las Vegas. Everybody's looking for a motive. There's some great pieces out there today about some of these massacres that we've experienced together as a country. You quickly learned that there was something very devious behind the individual, and clearly that was the case in Las Vegas, but the why is still escaping us. But the sheriff did say in an interview, he says, I'm confident we will get there. And that's Sheriff Lombardo there out in Las Vegas.
And to learn now that he was plotting out other cities and attacks in other cities. Very scary to continue to learn the details coming out of this bill. Meanwhile, a decision on the Iran nuclear deal, it could be imminent. Will President Trump ultimately kick the can down the road to Congress? And should he? We'll talk to Congressman Adam Kinzinger. Plus this.
We would like to see a clear understanding of the facts, and we'd like to see input from the victims' families, from law enforcement, from policymakers.
So then there's the White House keeping an open mind about putting regulations on these bump stocks you've been hearing about all week, as we learn chilling new details about the killer's plans for that evening. We'll get Capra in a moment. What we know so far, 5 days into this investigation.
And not again. Please, no. Here comes Tropical Storm Nate, targeting the U.S. mainland. We will tell you where that storm is headed and just how powerful it may be, as Vice President Mike Pence heads to the U.S. Virgin Islands to see the destruction there after visiting Puerto Rico last night.
Our administration is continuing to work tirelessly to clear every road, reach every community, and bring aid to every Puerto Rican in need. And we will not stop until the job is done.
Well, an alarming report revealing the personal cell phone of White House Chief of Staff John Kelly may have been hacked. Politico reporting hackers or a foreign government may have had access to data on his cell phone. The suspected breach was discovered after Kelly turned his phone over to the White House tech support this summer, complaining it wasn't working properly.
Any evidence that he planned to survive this or try to escape?
Yes.
Are there any other persons of interest in this investigation?
Look at the weapon obtaining, the different amounts of tannerite available. Do you think this was all accomplished on his own? Self-value, face value. You got to make the assumption he had to have some help at some point.
Everybody's asking this question. That was from Wednesday. The Las Vegas Sheriff Joe Lombardo saying all signs point to the gunman Paddock getting help before killing 58 at that music festival. John Sheehan, former Las Vegas Metro Police Sergeant and SWAT officer, with me now. And you've been a terrific guest for us all week, so thank you for coming back today.
Thanks for having me back, Bill.
What do you think about this idea about he had to have some help? Does that fit with what you're learning?
I don't know, because a lot of times, or most times that we go back to methodologies of active shooters, unless there are two shooters involved or multiple shooters involved, these people usually act alone. And I would go back to the fact that our shooter rented that hotel room 3 days ahead of time before he committed this heinous act, and had all the time in the world to get all that equipment, ammunition, firearms up to the room, set up the cameras. Heck, he could have even made trips back to Mesquite to go and reload and get stuff at his house and come back. It's only 90 miles away. He's got 3 days. So not sure I can get there quite yet until we see what's on those computers.
Very interesting. What about the escape theory? As an investigator, what evidence would you have to find or discover that would lead you to believe that he thought he was going to make it out of there?
Well, I've been through thousands of live missions in SWAT, and a lot of times when we have barricaded subjects that try to escape and we find evidence of that, it's usually one of two ways. They've either drawn up some sort of a map of an escape route, they have some sort of plans on paper in the structure that they're in, or there's actual physical evidence. Now look at the hotel room in Mandalay Bay. How could anybody possibly get out of that hotel room except out of the front door? It's 32 floors up. You obviously can't go out the window. He's a 64-year-old man. The only sign physically that you would possibly have would be maybe he's trying to burrow a hole through a wall and get into adjoining rooms and try to get out that way and secrete himself out.
We don't have that evidence, though, right, John?
We don't have that evidence. We don't know what the police have.
Maybe they found something in the car. Maybe they found something at the home back in Mesquite that told them he expected to return home.
Well, if he expected to return home after what he did, then we really have to believe he's as delusional as we all thought he was. There was no way that once he started his onslaught that he was going to leave that hotel room, probably leaving that hotel room alive either. He was going to die. He's forfeiting his life as soon as he began this rampage.
Yeah. Two last questions here. There's a report out today that says he wanted to buy tracer fire at a gun show, but apparently there was none in supply. I don't know that report to be true. If you have more information to confirm it, tell us now. But the tracer fire at nighttime would tell him whether or not he is hitting his target or not. Because without the tracer fire, he's just firing into the dark of night.
Correct. It would make him a more accurate killer. Every fifth round, traditionally in a belt-fed ammunition with tracer rounds in it, would be the round that would go out that for people that are uneducated on it, it glows. It looks sort of like a Star Wars blaster fire as it's going out, and it makes you a much more accurate
It's almost like a pointer or a laser that can...
It's an indicator, yes, Bill. It's an indicator.
Last question on all this now. We've been told very little about motivation. In your history, professional history, how rare is it that you find a motive so elusive as we apparently have at this point in this investigation?
It's pretty rare because usually an active shooter will leave some sort of a manifesto, some sort of a note, will have communicated at the last minute prior to the onslaught to someone their intent to do what they're going to do. And for this man to be as closed-mouthed as he is, and we don't know what he's told his girlfriend, what we're going to find on those computers yet, but it is pretty unique. You're right.
And those devices apparently are at the FBI, Quantico, for examination right now. John Sheehan, thank you again for coming back today.
Bill. Sure.
All right, Sandra.
Meanwhile, a top NRA executive slamming the media and Democrats for their hypocrisy on gun control.
And this Hollywood crowd makes billions a year every single day teaching gun irresponsibility to the American public. The hypocrisy is beyond belief.
The organization is, however, siding with calls for a review of the gun modifier used by the shooter. A fair and balanced debate with our panel coming up.
Also, one of the survivors in Las Vegas facing the president in the hospital and standing up with a gunshot wound on the leg. And now he's taking heat from it. We'll tell you from where as he sat down with our own Sean Hannity in the hospital bed to explain why.
I told my family, the President of the United States comes in this room, no matter who the president is, you stand up and you shake their hand and show them the respect that they deserve.
Here we go again. States along the Gulf Coast now bracing for what is the moment of a tropical, for the moment anyway, it is a tropical storm. Nate is churning closer to the U.S. That storm's been a killer already. Blamed for at least 22 deaths in Nicaragua and Honduras and Costa Rica. Flooding forcing 5,000 in the shelters in Costa Rica. Nate's expected to strengthen, could slam the Gulf states as a Category 1 hurricane late this weekend. So the governor in Louisiana warning everybody in that state to be prepared right now.
We have been blessed when Harvey went left and Irma went right. That is not what we anticipate out of Nate. So everyone should take this very seriously.
So southeastern Louisiana still recovering from Tropical Storm Harvey, which flooded streets and swamped a lot of cars and homes in that state.
Meanwhile, Vice President Pence on his way to the U.S. Virgin Islands as we speak. He'll be in Puerto Rico later today. Mr. Pence yesterday meeting with displaced Puerto Rican families at a disaster relief center inside Orlando's International Airport. The Vice President promising them the full support of the U.S. government.
We stand with you, and we will be with you every step of the way until we see the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico say levanta. The images of destruction have moved the hearts of all of the American people. The President often says, when one part of America hurts, we all hurt. When one part of America struggles, we all struggle.
Mike Tobin is live from San Juan. Mike, what's the activity like on that island right now?
You know, 2 weeks, Melissa, since the hurricane, and you can still break the activities down to 3 different points. You've got rebuilding and cleanup, and that is largely happening by individuals, happening by hand. You have restoration of power. That's the big job, and it's happening very slowly. And you still have the distribution of aid more than 2 weeks out. And from that, we get some remarkable stories, not the least of which is coming from the FBI's elite hostage rescue team and their tactical helicopter unit. They were out here with the helicopters. They ran into a private sector donor who had aid and voluntarily changed their mission. And what the guys in the helicopter unit did is they just flew around till they could find open soccer fields, open baseball diamonds, and they would put the helicopters down and hand out all the food, water, medicine that they could get their hands on. And sadly, what I hear from the agents in that particular unit is there is still a tremendous need for aid, particularly in the remote towns in the center of the island, high up in the mountains where there are bad roads. The trucks still aren't getting to them, Melissa.
It's Sandra, Mike, but that's all right. The Oaxaca Dam. Everybody's talking about this, Mike. What is the status of that dam at this point?
The Oaxaca Dam is still the biggest threat for a big catastrophic failure, if you will. That dam hadn't been updated since the 80s. And during the course of the hurricane, the output pipes jammed, which was one problem. You also had a tremendous amount of water coming into the reservoir. So we had all this water that went over the spillway. It's supposed to go over the spillway, but it had just never handled this kind of volume before.
Such a volume of water came through so fast, and the spillway itself really had some structural issues, and it undermined and ripped out the bottom half of the spillway, and thus is starting to erode back that spillway and the bottom of the dam.
And the foundation of that spillway is pretty much sand. If it erodes all the way up to the dam, you could be talking about a catastrophic failure of the dam, which would flood the hundreds of families down below. So what the Navy pilots and Marines on the ground are doing is they're hooking up those big old Jersey barriers to a CH-53 helicopter, and they drop it at the foot of that spillway to make a big pile of rocks. If they can make that pile big enough, it'll shore up the foundation of that spillway, in theory anyway, and stop the erosion. Melissa?
Amazing work they're doing down there. Mike Tobin, thank you.
Certainly is. Meanwhile, the Trump team now clarifying the president's remarks on Puerto Rico's staggering $74 billion debt. President early in the week said he wanted to wipe that out. Well, Press Secretary Sarah Sanders addressed it yet again yesterday.
There's a process for how to deal with Puerto Rico's debt, and it'll have to go through that process to have a lasting recovery and growth. This was a process that was put in place and set up under Obama, and that has a board of advisors that deals with that debt, and it'll go through that process as we move forward.
We'll see how that process works out in the end. You coming from a money background.
That rocked markets, I'll tell you.
Right. I mean, you pulled it up, the graph on your phone, and said, look at this, Hemmer.
Yeah.
It's fallen off the table.
The Puerto Rican bonds. And you're talking about $74 billion in debt. Yeah. Who pays for that?
Right. And there are a lot of people on the line for that. Has it recovered, or once the comments were made, has it?
No, I mean, it hasn't gotten a lot worse since then. But Bill, I mean, it was a big comment to make. Yeah. Goldman Sachs, are we talking taxpayers make up for that? So
gotta find the money
somewhere. You don't just kind of throw that around.
So
we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, right. And she talked about the process, so we'll see how the process unfolds coming up soon from D.C.
One of Hollywood's hottest producers under fire for allegations of sexual harassment going back decades. We'll tell you who's making the charges, including an A-list actress.
What a story that has become. Also, President Trump could be on the verge of decertifying that Iran nuclear deal without actually killing it outright. Will its fate now rest in the hands of Congress? Adam Kinzinger is up next on That Live.
A lot of countries are going to have their opinions on whether the U.S. should stay in the deal or not. But those countries don't have Iranians saying death to America. They're not saying death to Germany. They're not saying all of those things.
President Trump has got just under 10 days now to decide whether to leave the Iran nuclear deal. Here's what he said last night about it during a meeting with top military leaders.
We must not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons. The Iranian regime supports terrorism and exports violence, bloodshed, and chaos across the Middle East. That is why we must put an end to Iran's continued aggression and nuclear ambitions. They have not lived up to the spirit of their agreement.
Joining me now is Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who's also a pilot in the Air National Guard. Good to see you here, Congressman.
Hey, you too. Thanks.
I understand you had a big meeting yesterday with the President's National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. How'd that go?
Look, it was good. I'll tell you what makes me comfortable is when I see the president and his team in the Situation Room. The president wasn't there yesterday, but HR was. And I see how they have a grip, not just on the Iran issue, but on the broader issues of the world. Under the prior administration, really all they wanted to do was get some kind of a deal with Iran on nuclear weapons and call it a day. And we got that some kind of a deal. And then over the period of time, we've seen Iran grow in influence. They're in Syria. They're basically supplying Hezbollah. They're putting big threats against Israel. And they're meddling in Iraq and everywhere else in the Middle East because of this money from the deal. So the administration has a comprehensive plan, of which the JCPOA, the Iran deal, is a part of it. But I think there's going to be a broader confrontation against this terrible regime.
So when the president called it the calm before the storm, what did he mean by that?
Well, only the president knows what he meant by that. I think, look, there's a sense of unpredictability with President Trump, which I think works in his favor. So, you know, our enemies or adversaries don't necessarily know what his next action would be, and there's some huge benefit in that as they look and say, okay, well, what's he going to do to us next? Because the thing we have to remember as Americans is we have a ton of power and a ton of ability to do things, and so bringing our allies along with us, for instance, in confronting Iran or in pushing back against Iran and Syria, or in eventually reimposing sanctions because Iran is not living by the spirit of this deal, then I think the calm is where we are now. The storm is finally confronting Iran, not necessarily militarily, but in a whole host of other areas.
Defense Secretary Mattis seems to disagree with walking away from this deal. It says, stay in it for now. It is in the best interest of the national security of this country. Contradicting the president. Where does the president go with this?
I don't know if it's necessarily a contradiction, because a decertifying of the Iran deal does not necessarily mean we're tearing it up and leaving. Part of me would love to just tear up this deal and leave the deal altogether, but decertification is a process where now Congress comes in with the administration and figures out how to possibly bring our allies along on reimposing sanctions in areas like missile development as well, which was not included under this deal. So I don't know if there's disagreement, and if there is disagreement, I think it's healthy disagreement within an administration, because frankly, I don't want people, and I don't think the president wants people in his administration, they're going to just tell him what he's already decided. He wants, in essence, a team of rivals that are offering competing views, and I'll tell you, H.R. McMaster and Mattis and Secretary Tillerson, they're all very smart people on these issues and bring their own strengths.
But I mean, he did hint. He said he reiterated his belief that Tehran is not living up to the spirit of the deal. The president leaving off that we will be hearing from him shortly on Iran, with that deadline coming up. That being said, Congressman, I want to get what's going on here with the you're one of 3 House Republicans that you have sent a letter to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms asking to reevaluate these bump stocks, or these devices that convert the semi-automatic weapons to nearly machine gun status. You want to look into this further. Why?
So I'm a huge Second Amendment advocate. I'm a gun owner, and I love shooting guns. I've shot the bump stock before. What my fear is, 3 days ago, nobody knew what this was. Today, everybody knows what this is. When I shot it before, I was actually surprised to find out it was technically legal by ATF. I want the ATF to reevaluate this, which they did under the Obama administration and found it technically compliant, because if the ATF can handle this, then all the new devices that come to the commercial shelf, the ATF can determine if it lives within the spirit of the ban on automatic weapons. The problem with jumping to legislation, like some of my colleagues have done, is if we ban these certain devices and then somebody creates something new that gets around the law, are we going to have to do another law? The best place is in the ATF. If the ATF can't rule to say that these are wrong, then we can look at a legislative fix for it.
And other Republicans on board, we've heard from Senator John Cornyn of Texas saying that's something that we want to look at, open to some sort of change. Do you worry that this is either a slippery slope as far as further gun legislation that many Democrats are calling for, or Congressman, do you have a fear that this gets away from the real conversation and this absolutely evil act that we saw play out in Las Vegas Sunday night?
Yeah, both are a fear. I think it's important to note that evil, you can't screen evil until it commits evil acts, right? You also have to understand that Democrats don't want to just ban bump stocks, they want to ban guns in many cases, and that's a reality. And so we have to block against that slippery slope. But when you look at something like a bump stock and you look at the law that everybody agrees on banning fully automatic weapons, this is a workaround to the spirit of that law. And I think we have to reasonably say, okay, this is something we can address. But you already see it in the left because they've said that going to the ATF isn't enough. We need legislation. And so continue to watch that. But we have to be reasonable on this, which I think is the right thing to do.
Before we let you go, have you heard back anything from the ATF since you sent that letter?
Not yet, and hopefully we will on an expedited basis.
All right, Congressman, thanks for coming on.
Anytime.
So here is just one of the many survivors from the Las Vegas shooting speaking out on his meeting with the president and the first lady. That's gone viral. Check it out.
Literally just came from there. I don't care what anybody has to say to me, man. He cared. He wanted to listen to me and shake my hand and thank me and just was so awesome. And Melania was so sweet. And to me, it felt like they genuinely cared about the people here and what happened.
That is Thomas Gunderson, shot in the leg, rising to greet the president and first lady. And he says he was grateful for the moment. He'll never forget it. And posting on social media that he will never lie down when the president of the great country of the United States of America comes in to shake my hand.
What
cool
a moment
there. So Hannity found him yesterday, too, and he didn't get up. And John said, "You're not going to stand for me?" And he said, "Well, you're not the president of the United States." It was a cool moment.
He also spoke with his parents, which was really, really a neat moment. Those parents said that they learned of the shooting watching Fox News that night.
Wow. That's a tender moment right there,
Indeed.
that handshake there in Las Vegas.
And, of course, we have been talking in the wake of that shooting a lot about the politics of gun control. The debate is alive and kicking. But would a law have stopped this killer? We will debate that next.
One thing the American public always knows is the elites always protect themselves, and they always protect themselves with guns. And then they lecture the American public how you shouldn't do that. But in the heart of the American public all over this country, they see these monsters, and they don't want to be alone out there. They want to be able to protect themselves. When the water's rising, when it goes dark, the American public values this freedom to protect themselves. And now you have Dianne Feinstein and Schumer and the media to get this horrible tragedy, and they want to piggyback their whole agenda to ban guns, restrict law-abiding people for the last 20 years, this circus on the back of this tragedy and enact it.
So that's the head of the NRA now pushing back against what they call efforts by anti-gun activists to politicize the Vegas massacre. But the NRA is willing to consider regulation of that bump stock device, which allowed the killer to fire his semi-automatic weapon like a machine gun. Matt Schlapp, former White House political director George W. Bush and chairman of the American Conservative Union, former Ohio Congressman Dennis Kucinich, and a Fox News contributor as well. And gentlemen, good day to both of you. Statement from the NRA on that whole bump stock issue. In Las Vegas, reports indicate that certain devices were used to modify the firearms involved. Despite the fact that the Obama administration approved the sale of bump fire stocks on at least 2 occasions, the National Rifle Association is calling on Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives to immediately review whether these devices comply with federal law, end quote. Wayne LaPierre was on fire last night, Matt. What are you sensing from this so far? Is this an issue for the ATF, or is it bigger for that in Congress?
Well, I have to say, for Wayne LaPierre and Chris Cox, who are friends and great constitutionalists, this is tough. This country said in 1934 that it should be almost impossible for any private citizen to own a fully automatic weapon. And Wayne LaPierre has been fighting with gun grabbers for decades on the fact that a semi-auto is not an automatic weapon. And what this tragedy demonstrated to everybody is the horror when an automatic weapon can get in the hands of an evil madman. And I think it's appropriate. We passed a law in 1934. That's almost 100 years ago. Technologies change. We have to retrofit laws for the modern context. And I think it's right to go back to ATF for whatever reason. The Obama administration, which never really fully understood the Second Amendment or guns, might have gotten this wrong. And we ought to look at it, and we ought to do what's right within the context of that law.
The ATF ruled until 7 years ago it was legal under the law, Congressman, because it did not alter the internal mechanism of the gun, and hence the rationale as to why it was still out there. You're seeing Walmart and Amazon already pull this thing offline. Where are you on this?
Well, where I am is this, Bill. You know, I agree with a number of things that Matt said, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper. We've got to end the polarization in this country over this issue, and we need a new path forward. And that path forward, I believe, is addressing the underlying issues of violence in our society and of mental health needs. And when we do that, I think we can bring people together. And we may not ever really resolve this issue of guns in our country, but we certainly can address domestic violence, spousal abuse, violence in the school, gang violence, racial violence, and gun violence, but not from the standpoint of being in warring camps and fighting each other over that. When we can really make some progress, we need to seize the moment and address the violence and the mental health.
This could be